And welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Tidal Flooding Talk, brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition in conjunction with our broadcast partners at Tri-X 57. We are here today to talk about FEMA buyouts versus risky real estate here. We've had a string of meteorologists as guests over the past couple of weeks. Palma, we're finally giving you a break. We're going to get out of the strict weather realm for this one. So there you go.
Well, welcome to the show, Jim. Yeah, we both have had, FEMA is obviously a very big topic for all of us living on the shore. So whether it's people dealing with just FEMA new rules and standards, but I don't know if a lot of our viewers have had much experience with, buyouts and things like that. So could you give us just some general background on how that works?
Yeah, I have to. And thanks for having me. It's great to be here talking about these things. So again, Jim Elliott down in Houston and Rice University. So some of that contextualizes my experience with FEMA. So just a little background on me on how I got into this and then sort of what the buyouts are. If you look at my CV, my first job was down in New Orleans at Tulane University, and I had just gotten tenure when Hurricane Katrina hit. And so at that time, FEMA was literally a four-letter word. People talk about getting to FEMA'd, and so began getting interested as a sociologist of sort of urban and environment dynamics on how they collide and come together. So that was really my introduction. And when we finally evacuated and then came back, there were discussions about what should we do with a lot of the low-lying neighborhoods in New Orleans, right? 80% of New Orleans, the city proper, is below sea level. And so there were some folks thinking about what to do, and they engaged some think tanks, and then they basically came out with a plan to sort of designate sort of the most flood-prone areas as areas where the city would work in conjunction with the federal government. They weren't clear on the plans on where the actual money would come from. Maybe it was going to come from FEMA, and I'll come to that in a minute. But they began to just identify what would be maybe the places where if we could go in and talk to folks and buy them out of their flood-prone properties, maybe we could, sort of feed two birds with one hand, where we could help protect those people by not having them go back and live in harm's way, but also remove the risk for future generations, right? And so they actually started to move forward, but then it wasn't clear if a lot of the equity considerations were being sort of moved forward. There were plans to sort of, how do we work with different communities and give them voice? And then that sort of faded. And so the local newspaper down there, the Times-Picayune, came out with this map to sort of interrupt that process. And they put a map on the front page, and they had these green dots of where they were saying the city officials were going to work with the federal government to basically remove people. And that, as you might imagine, if you're out and you see this newspaper and you're still evacuating, you're like, oh, that's my neighborhood. So in New Orleans, there was very much this sort of notion of being green dotted. It's like you didn't want to be green dotted. It's like sort of having your home taken away from you without conversation. And so that had been on sort of my mind. And I got to Houston, where after Hurricane Harvey, there was more conversations about the FEMA buyouts in particular. So one of the things that's interesting is, you think about FEMA doing a lot of things with respect to flooding that you and your guests probably know about. They help run, the disaster response and recovery, the individual assistance programs, the public assistance to get the infrastructure back. They help sort of plan, but a lot of that was around sort of keeping people in place. And so what they began to do is think about, can we take this concept of paying people for their homes that might have some damage and allow them to get out, not be stuck in place by having lost equity, right? So give them a fair market price for their home as if it was intact, like it was before the disaster. So most of the people are getting approached after disaster, but it is true that FEMA is not the only one engaging in what they call property acquisitions, but it is primarily the biggest program, right? So we have the Department of Housing and Urban Development actually involved to smaller, and then the Small Business Administration. But FEMA is largely the federal agency that is overseeing these things. And they actually began in the 1990s as a rural program, basically. There were floods in the Midwest. My grandfather, rest in peace, was a farmer in Indiana, and his fields would flood from the Wabash all the time. So he wasn't alone in that. As they approached for federal government for assistance, the program really developed out of FEMA to help the repetitive losses in rural communities around farmland. But then in the 2000s, here in Houston, you have Allison and other places where it's like, okay, there are more and more people saying, I need to get out of the way. And local officials say, we need to get them out of the way. So they began to lobby their representatives in Congress, I think, and then talk to FEMA and say, hey, why don't we take that program that was sort of built and initiated in rural spaces and bring it into the cities and the urban spaces. And that's where it happened. But there's not a whole lot of conversation about what it means to sort of buy out farmers and their farmland versus what it means to buy out people in dense urban environments. And so really the history from 2000 on is FEMA working with local flood jurisdictions to think about where this property acquisition or home buyout might be. And there are a couple of features that are worth pointing out. One, because it's a federal program and getting FEMA dollars, it has to abide by certain constitutional restrictions, including not exercising eminent domain or taking someone's home by force. So when you get involved with the FEMA program, which is basically what buyouts are largely funded by nationwide, it has to be voluntary. And it's also the case that it has to be initiated by the local flood jurisdiction or authority. They fill out an application, and that application is basically a risk cost-benefit ratio. It says, hey, instead of paying out the National Flood Insurance Program premium on these homes, yet again, because oftentimes it's the 8th or 10th time they've done it on their home, what if we just paid them to move and we basically bought their house and then we take it over and we demolish it and basically return it to nature and have it be part of the green infrastructure that helps mitigate flooding. It's a win-win, gets people out of harm's way, helps reduce flooding, hopefully, in that way. And so they have to fill out these applications and project how much they imagine the savings would be. So example, here in Houston, we've got neighborhoods that have flooded over the past 20 years, like 6-8 times. There are homes that are valued at $400,000 that have basically received $1.6 million and repetitive sort of returns from their flood loss premium. So as we know, the FEMA flood insurance program is financially insolvent. The government has said it cannot fund itself, and it goes $20 billion in debt almost every decade now. And so this is a way, rewrite the insurance premiums with this Risk 2.0 program, which is part of this, but also implement the buyout program. So last point on this is, you know, when I started looking into this, I wonder where this happens. Probably, you know, maybe Miami, maybe there's a little in Jersey, a lot in Jersey actually. But then I discovered Houston, a lot in Houston. In some respects and numbers wise, we might be among the capital with you all in terms of that. But when I looked at it, I found that every single state in the country has engaged FEMA in this program. You know, more than I think 500 different cities and towns, about 2,000 different neighborhoods. So when we talk about the buyout program or the property acquisition program, as FEMA calls it, it really is sort of the locals reaching out to the feds, trying to do a cost benefit calculation, and then trying to go out and work with communities to see who would be willing in the most risky areas to actually sell their home and how does that work.
Awesome. All right. Well, hey, really good base here for the rest of the episode. We got to get to our first break here, but we'll come right back with Tidal Flooding. And welcome back, everybody, to Tidal Flooding Talk. We're back here with Jim Elliott, and we are exploring the map and the program that his department created. This is through the Rice University Center for Coastal Futures and Adaptive Resilience. If you go to cfar.rice.edu, you can make your way over to this map. I believe it's pretty much, you scroll down a little bit and you see it right there. You'll find it. So Jim's going to share his screen with us. He's going to take you through the website, how it works. And at some point, we'll have him poke around in a few places. But Jim, floor is yours on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. So we've been talking a little bit about property acquisitions, especially the largest federal funder, FEMA, working with local jurisdictions. So as researchers, in Houston, we have a number of these sort of in operation and under consideration, but we also, as we began to sort of think more about it, we were curious about the literature and the research that's been done. And there are a lot of great case studies of local areas going through buyouts and what happens. And so that's invaluable. What was less available was a big picture of where these things are happening, and in particular, where people are moving. Oftentimes, the case study research is about the negotiations. How did the application work? How did the interaction with those participants work? So what we did is we basically did a lot of work behind the scenes. We got data that was publicly released from FEMA on where publicly funded buyouts had happened. So there's a database, and it was basically decreed to be in the public interest to release the information on the name and the address of people who have engaged in these FEMA buyouts through their local flood jurisdiction. And so we got that database, and then we identified those folks who we could pretty much confirm were owner occupants. So people would have to move. We're interested in the retreat component. And then we mapped those. And because of the data, it's very hard to get data on how people move. The Census Bureau does not make it publicly available. So we wanted to see what we can do. So there are these data companies out there that will sell you data. So they're the same companies that sell the Fortune 500 for marketing campaigns. But basically, we assemble these data, and they're reasonable data, and they cover close to now 200 million US adults. If you have a consumer trace or profile, you own a cell phone, you have a bank account, they get all this information. They identify where you live by name, and you can follow people through time. So those data get pretty reasonable by the year 2007. So over here in the upper right corner, we said, okay, we're going to start it in 2007. And I just have the slider bar. We can go back and forth on this. And if you're interested, the ones that just started the first couple of years, you can do that, or a single year. But basically, for demonstration, say, okay, show us everywhere that there's been these buyouts, right? And so then we broke it down. How many buyout movers are in these zones? So what we mean by a zone is we identified each address where there was a FEMA-funded buyout, and then we mapped it. And then what we did is for that year that the policy was implemented, we used these data to recreate a half-mile buffer around the buyout. So we could build a neighborhood, basically a small neighborhood, and then populate it with the people who are living there that year of implementation, and then see who moved. So we can see how many people moved through the buyout program. That's through the FEMA negotiated policy that removes the risk by buying the home and then demolishing it so no one can move in. But then we have what we would call the market movers. These are people we observed in the same neighborhood, but did not sell their home to FEMA, but they sold their home or otherwise transferred it to someone else.
Got it. So just to jump in, because that was actually a question I had for you when I was going through this website, is I couldn't really tell I didn't really understand the difference. So just to reiterate what you're saying, buyout movers are strictly people who took that buyout, and the market movers are people who live around the buyout mover who moved. Is that
exactly. So let's say Palma, we all live in this sort of area, this community, and we're living on the same street. The buyout folks come in from the local flood jurisdiction or some company or a third party they sort of hire to come in and talk to us about it. Palma goes, okay, I like your offer. I'll give it. I'm going to leave. You can demolish my home. But Joe and Jim say, I don't know. I think I can sell through the market, make a little bit more money, or I have a little bit, or you didn't offer me because you didn't get enough money and the government ran out. And we're like, shoot, I feel risky. I don't know if I want my home equity tied up in a flood prone area, but for whatever reason, we can't tell the reason. But Joe and Jim move through the market. We sell it to someone else. It could be a company, it could be another person. So we're the market movers, Palma's the policy mover. The big difference is that when you add this stuff up over the span of sort of the whole US, for every buyout that we talk about in a local zone, there are on average 12 or 13 folks who are selling the market on the market and just having someone else come in. So the average neighborhood or zone that participates has about 9 or 10 folks. So imagine 10 folks sell their home, demolished. The planners are worried, is it a checkerboard? Can we buy out a lot of people, or who's saying yes to the buyout or not? And then all of a sudden you've got, 10 people from the neighborhood moving through the buyout. And then you've got another 130 or 100 moving just through the market. What that means in terms of sustainability is Joe and Jim moved and we basically transferred the risk. We remained resilient by handing it off to someone else. Good luck. Yeah. Maybe you know what you're doing. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're new to town and you didn't do your research. Maybe there wasn't enough information on the flood risk. Lots of pressure from homeowners on local governments not to divulge flood risk. That's beginning to change. Palma did sort of a long-term service. She sold, it's demolished, no one else can go in. The city, as part of that program, has to maintain, like cut the lawn and do things, and it's undeveloped and has that flood mitigation. So the first thing we see is that there's a lot more people sort of going, yep, I get it, I'm out of here. But most of them are going, I need to find somebody else to absorb this risk. So I'll do that. So there's more, less of a one-way exit. You hear about people, oh, there's a retreat. We're all going to move from the coast and we're all going to move to Duluth, or something like that. And it's like, sort of that's like a one-way exit. But what's really happening, even in these zones that are at the front of federal government efforts to remove risk, it's more a revolving door. And what does that do? It doesn't help insurance rates because people are coming in there. And, everybody's just trying. If you experience a flood and another flood, oftentimes people weather one flood, but oftentimes by the second or third, they're like, I'm out. So people tend to be risk minimalists. And so if I'm in a tight housing market here in Houston, people see a flood zone and they go, oh my gosh, I hope that allows me to get in. Some of our fastest growing and most demand neighborhoods in Houston are actually ones that flooded. And they will put up signs that this is a buyout neighborhood. Look at this little house Palma sold that's now a little pocket park. That's a benefit. They don't see, oh my gosh, the water is coming. They're going, cool, I can get in this neighborhood. So that's the one thing. But what you can do, and I want to encourage your viewers to do, is you can zoom in. So let's say, we care about Jersey. That's not the only place we care about.
Are you saying we don't care about Jersey? That was a little.
Of course we do.
Okay,
but not only Jersey, but we'll zoom in there. Yeah.
Understood.
So you can go in and say, oh, wow, I can keep going into these zones and say, okay, I'm curious in this neighborhood. I can go here and say, oh, there were 65 people who moved from this zone. There was a federally funded buyout zone and demolished their home before switched it. And then you can go, okay, well, what's the median distance? Are they all moving way off to climate havens on higher ground? This is actually a median distance of movers is about 18 miles. Nationwide, it's only 7 miles is the median. That's half the distance of the average daily commute. People are not, they are reshuffling. They are attached to their community. They're trying to find homes around them that are safe. And so when we look at their flood risk score of their address that they end up in, movers who go through the policy or the buyout versus the ones that go through the market, they're all uniform. They are looking for, low risk housing. So that's uniform. But then you can click on one of these things like here, and you could actually, the yellow is the market. So you can see where are people moving. We blurred it by a couple blocks so you can't hopefully identify individuals, but you can actually see, are they moving towards the water? Are they moving? And you can do this in each one and clear the flow lines. And you can go where you can zoom around the country, wherever your community is and take a look at this. And we did this in part to be able to get the information out, because we would talk to planners from across the country, whether it's, various storms hitting various places, and they say, do you have data on this? Like, what if we could make you a map and you could dial in and see yourself what's happening? So that's where we are.
Wow. So we have about 30 seconds left, but I do want to ask this. I felt like when I was going through the New Jersey map, though, that there were a number of people who might have been moving to more flood risk areas. I mean, I don't know what you saw in your, but because you are saying, right, correct me if I'm wrong, that the policy movers and the market movers are moving to the same type of area. Is that what you were saying?
They tend to be, they want to stay close by so they don't move far on average, because people want to stay there. But when we have these address level flood risk scores, and on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 and 2 is considered low risk. The majority of all of them are moving to 1 or 2. They got the message. They're moving to a safe destination.
Okay.
But what's telling is people used to study, are they moving out of the floodplain or not? And what the science and research is showing is there's so much variability within the floodplain that there's the people who are moving are in a neighborhood that's considered flood prone, but a lot of those houses aren't flooding. It's the people who are flooding and then look around and go, holy crap, my neighbors aren't flooding. So this whole idea that whole neighborhoods are underwater is true some places, but the vast majority are in neighborhoods where there's high variability. And you're right, they move somewhere that's maybe water prone, but they're finding that house that is not flood prone.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Really good. Awesome. We're going to take a final break here. We'll come back with Tidal Flooding Talk. Thanks to the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, your flood insurance bills are lower and your streets safer from the reality of flooding. Since beginning in 2013, we build more resilient shoreline communities. Our member towns develop and share in best practices that anticipate future concerns and create flooding solutions. From our town-specific free web app for flooding information to our weekly Tidal Flooding Talk show, we focus on flooding 24/7. Visit www.njcoastalcoalition.com for more.
Hello, welcome back. You are watching Tidal Flooding Talk. We are brought to you by the New Jersey Coastal Coalition, and we would like to remind our viewers to know your flood hazard. Do you know your property's flood risk? Visit FEMA.gov and enter your address to see your flood zone, elevation requirements, and more. Understanding your risk is the first step to staying prepared and protecting your home.
Awesome. We are back with Jim Elliott. So really interesting map. I poked around on it, when I first emailed you to come on and just kind of looking all across New Jersey. We in New Jersey with our Blue Acres program, one of the, I don't want to say controversy, it's not the right word, but one of the tiffs maybe is that, they're only happening in these low income area places as opposed to, the wealthier communities here. So from a New Jersey perspective, they're on the Delaware Bay Shore, or they're in, that area that you showed in the map. Not all that area is a affluent area. So is that something you studied? And if you did, what can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah, a great question. So others have studied this as well. I'll start with the top and then maybe lead into some of the findings.
Sure.
One is, people have pointed out that the buyout program can be sort of perceived as being structurally unequal, right? Let's say that you're a local flood authority and you want to buy out homes to make areas safer, and you convince FEMA to send you down, $100 million. Then if you want to buy more homes, which neighborhoods do you think you can buy more homes for that 100 million, right? You're going to go where you're going to hey, I can buy 100 of these homes, or I can buy 10 of these homes. So there's a sort of an incentive to go in and sort of really work in certain types of neighborhoods that oftentimes have been poorly served in the past by infrastructural investments that would make them safer. So there is a concern that basically wealthier neighborhoods get flood mitigation infrastructure that's costly, and lower income neighborhoods get buyouts, right? We're not going to invest in your community. We're going to basically pay you to move. And so that ties into, well, how do you move? It's still the case that FEMA funds and that whole process, require, at least on paper, that these transactions be voluntary. But what we're finding is that oftentimes people don't want to move unless they have somewhere to move to. It's not just about knowing your risk. It's about what are the other opportunities I have nearby to mitigate that risk in a reasonable house. So here in Houston, at least, we've got folks in homes that are, not that great quality, and they're valued at $65,000. So let's say FEMA comes in, or the local administration says, okay, $65,000, that's a fair market price for your home. Maybe we'll sprinkle another 10K on there to help you with relocation, 75K. And they look around and go, I don't see anywhere I can afford to move with 75K, because the market has moved so far away from that point. So then they say, I'm not going to move. I don't want to voluntarily move because I don't know where I would end up. And so unless it's far, far away, and they lose the community ties and the value there. So what's happening is a lot more experimentation in that. So here in Houston, I think we're one of the first places to be, Harris County in particular, to be experimenting with mandatory buyouts, where it's saying, okay, we're going to give you a year, community members in this flood area where we've got money approved. If you take it, great. If you don't, we're going to begin to exercise eminent domain and use our own local funds detached from FEMA funds so that we can push you out. And where do you think those experiments are happening? They're happening largely in Latinx communities with lower income working class folks. So there is always this tension of how do you maintain the equity and plan fairly and not have one tool for one group and another tool for another.
So, I didn't understand. I apologize. Are you saying that in that example you gave, if you take the buyer, are you getting more money than if the local government comes in?
So what'll happen is, there are political circumstances. No one wants to be perceived in the government as taking people's homes. That is not a victory,
No.
Right? But what happens is FEMA provides money and they say, you can't take people's homes. You can only voluntarily offer them. So they'll get into negotiations, right? Here's your fair market price. And so some folks who are oftentimes well-educated and well-connected can go, okay, FEMA, you provided, or local flood jurisdiction, this estimate, I'm not going to move unless you build that up and sort of counter offer. And so they'll go back and forth. And they found that certain neighborhoods and more affluent, more educated folks are more able to sort of oftentimes move the needle, or that they'll find that certain people in a neighborhood for the same house are being able to negotiate higher prices because it's just a private transaction. So you got that dynamic going on as well. But the other part is in trying to encourage folks to move, especially in lower income places, local governments have found that if you add a little bit more money, like instead of just the market price, if you provide some relocation assistance, here's an extra $5,000-$10,000 to help with the move, the moving company, or with the transition in some way, then they're trying to encourage people, because the local flood authorities win if they're successful in getting people to take the buyouts. If they don't, then they're left with this money. And they're like, okay, now what do we do with it? We don't want to give back to FEMA. We got to go out and encourage people. Because what people say oftentimes, I want to buy out, they'll stand in line. We're taking names for people who want buyouts. We're going to file the application. But then when push comes to shove, they're not happy with either the reality of what they begin to see as their lack of destinations, or the cost that they would incur for the move because the housing prices have gone up. So they stay in place.
Okay. All right. Really good. Jim, we appreciate you coming on. Where can people find out more about your work?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. So you can definitely go to CFAR, Coastal Futures and Adaptive Resilience. That's too long, but CFAR, CFAR.rice, like the food or the university.edu. And we've got our splash page, our homepage, and you can find this tracker tool in addition to other things that might be relevant to your viewers. I'll just make another pitch about something. We think of coastal and flooding and buyouts as somewhat fundamentally different in a place that's amenity rich tourism, Miami, then in industrial zones, maybe like New Jersey and the Gulf Coast, where the floods can oftentimes remobilize toxins. So we have a theme on coastal industrial communities and the special challenges.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Great. Well, hey, Jim, thanks again so much. So unfortunately, we ran out of time to do the one thing we can't stop talking about, tidal flooding or otherwise. So I can't invite you to the party on this one, Jim. We'll just have to have you come back and we'll hear what's on your mind outside of everything in your research there. But thank you very much, Jim, for coming on. We appreciate it. We'll be back with you with a new episode next Tuesday, as we do every night. You can find it on Dan Skeldon's social media channels, my social media channels, my streaming weather channel, TriX57.com, and the New Jersey Coastal Coalition social networks as well. So thank you, everybody, for listening, and we'll be with you next time.